Why? Why does it rain? Why does it snow? Why does the weather sometimes get bad? Why do I have to do this? Why do I have to do that? Why do I have to run? Why do I have to walk? Why do I have to drive? Why do I have to wake up? Why do I have to fall asleep? Why do I have to talk? Why is my hair messed up? Why does a fish swim? Why does a kangaroo hop? Why does a bunny hop? Why? Why? Why does it rain? Why does the sun pop up? Why does the um, earth go around the sun? Why does anything exist? Why? Why did we go to the moon? Supposedly. Why do we ask why? Why do we go to the bank? Why do we go to the store? Why do we eat? Why do we love? Why do we hate? Why do we do what we do? Why? Why look up? Why look down? Why look left? Why look right? Why put on slippers? Why put on shoes? Why put on pants? Why put on a shirt? Why take baths? Why take showers? Why look around the TV? Why look around the room? Why watch TV? Why am I asking so many why questions? Why is the sun yellow? Why is the grass green? Why are there clouds in the sky? Why do birds fly? Why do fish swim? Why do kangaroos hop? Why do bunnies hop? Why am I probably asking the same why questions over and over again? Why do we talk? Why do babies cry? Why do we have to use the restroom? Why do we always say, hey, what's up? Or, hey, what's going on? Or, how you doing? Why? Why do we have to fill up our gas tank? Why do we swim? Why do turtles have a shell? Why do sharks have all those teeth? Why were they looking for Nemo? Why does it take so long to get somewhere sometimes? Why do we have to pay money to do stuff? Why do we eat cheeseburgers? Why do we argue with each other? Why do we fight each other? Why do we always say mean things to each other? Why? Why? Why am I running out of why questions? There should be why, a lot of why question. Why is the sun hot? Why does it get dark at night? Why do we have 2 arms and not 4? Why do we have 2 legs and not 4? Why, whenever you can dance, you choose to sit down? Why do we sing? Why do we communicate? Why do we do just about anything? Why did I think this was a good idea? Why do we always have to wear shirts, pants, and shoes and socks when in public? Why do birds fly? Why do they get worms from the ground? Why do they pick up tree branches and form a nest? Why do chickens lay eggs? Why do we ask ourselves which came first, the chicken or the egg? Why do we always have to ask questions? Why? Why do people get pulled over? Why did I get that ticket? Why is she doing this? Why is he doing this? Why does the world spin? Why does gravity work? Why are we here? Why did this happen? Why did that happen? Why am I repeating myself? Why does anything work? Why do babies cry? Why do we get sick? Why do we have to go to the store to get groceries? Why does my car run? Why do I have to buy a car? Why do I have to get a job? Why do I have to pay my bills? Why do I have to talk to anyone? Why do I have to spin around in circles 3 times? Why does the early bird get the worm? Why? Why? Just why? It don't really make sense. I mean, like, why do we play games? Why do we love each other? Why do we hate each other? Why do we fight each other? Why do we always argue with each other? Why do we go swimming? Why do we go fishing? Why do we go hunting? Why do we watch sports? Why do we get frustrated when things don't go our way? Why do we talk? Why do dogs bark? Why do cats meow? Why does a squirrel make the squirrel noises? I don't know if that's how a squirrel sounds, but if it is, why? Why are we here? Why do I keep repeating myself? Why does a snake snake? Why does a dog dog? Why does a cat cat? Why does a turtle turtle? Why does a cheetah run? Why does a bird fly? Why is the grass greener on the other side? Why? Why? Why do people get mad? Why do people cry? Why do we have feelings? Why? Why? Why am I running out of why questions that I can't think of? Why? Why do we watch one thing but not the other? Why didn't Rose share the door with Jack? Why does Hollywood have to be so satanic? Why do people go to church? Why do we wake up? Why am I repeating my questions? Why do I stare into the corner of the room? Why don't that make any sense? Why does it rain? Why do we get tornadoes? Why do people live in trailer parks? Why do people like to play golf? Why do people like to throw frisbees? Why do we go hiking? Why do we go to Mizumik Park and wait in long lines? Why do we go to McDonald's to get a cheeseburger? Why do we, I don't know, have war? Why do we always have to ask ourselves, why? I wonder why that is. Why does a dog bark? Why does a fish swim? Why are giraffes tall? Why did the dinosaurs get wiped out? Why this universe? Why haven't aliens came yet? Why do we vote? Why do we share? Why do we care? Why are we nice? Why am I asking a bunch of why questions? Why can I hardly think of any why questions? Why? Just why? Why? Whenever you run to the toilet. Wait, why did I just have a brain freeze? Why do we eat ice cream? Why is ice cream cold? Why is something hot? Why do we like to go camping? Why do we go swimming? Why does a squirrel like to get nuts? Why does fish like to swim? Why am I keep repeating these questions? Why do worms like living in the dirt? Why do bees collect nectar? Why do nuts fall from trees? Why do trees grow fruit? Why do we farm? Why do we have to be mean to each other sometimes? Why can't that person be as cool as the next person? Why do people do the wrong thing? Why do people do the right thing? Why do we always have to be right on everything? Why do people admit that they're wrong about something? Why wear that shirt over that shirt? Why wear those shoes over those shoes? Why get this brand over this brand? Why not do something? Why do I look like that? Because I'm fat. Why do I not exercise? Why? Because I will. Why? I'm running out of questions. Why? Why? Why am I making this video? Why? Why do people exercise? Why do we sweat? Why do we get nervous? Why do we get annoyed? Why do we get mad? Why do we get sad? Why do we cry? Why do people go to the dentist? Why do we have to go to work every single day? Why do we get paychecks? Why is life so hard sometimes? Why does not the whole world just love each other? Why am I running out of why questions? Why is my brain not working? Why does it get warm? Why does it snow? Why does it thunderstorm? Why do bats usually only fly at night? Why do bears hibernate during the winter? Don't they love snow? Apparently not. Why is this also relevant? Why does the sun go down at night? Why? I want to know why! Somebody tell me why! Why?